Hi, everybody. Welcome to EWA's webinar today about getting embargoed access to a learning loss report. Just so you know, at the very top, everybody who registered for this event is going to be emailed the report later today to have the most updated version. And the embargo for that report will lift on December 1st at 12:01 a.m. Eastern. So without further ado, I'm going to pass off to Matt Barnum, who is our moderator today. He's from Chalkbeat, and he's written a bunch of great stories about learning loss and the previous report NWEA came out with. So I'm going to pass off to him and turn my camera off, and I'll be back for the audience Q&A.
Thanks, Allison, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm really excited. I know we can't all see each other, but I can see how many people are on this webinar, and that's a lot, and I'm excited for this rich conversation about a really important topic that I know a lot of us are interested in continuing to cover. We have two great folks here to walk us through what we've learned. First, we have Megan Kuhfeld, who is a senior research scientist at NWEA, and we have Chris Minnich, the CEO of NWEA. Megan is going to walk us through the results that they have to share. Chris is going to give us a high-level overview. I'm going to share my very brief thoughts, and then I'll ask a couple questions, and then I'll turn it over to you all for questions. So Megan, how about you take it away with the results?
Okay, great. Let's see. Okay, are you all seeing the slides now?
I am. Yep.
Perfect. Okay, thank you all for coming. I'm here to talk today about our study using NWEA's MAP growth assessment data to look at learning during COVID-19. And this was a joint work with many great collaborators at NWEA, and we'll be presenting some initial findings today. So in this study, we were hoping to answer two main research questions. The first is, how are students performing this fall relative to a typical school year? So in this study, we're comparing students in third grade to students in the prior third grade in fall of 2019. So this is a cross-sectional comparison of students in grades 3 to 8 relative to this fall and fall of 2020 relative to students in fall of 2019 in the same grades. Our second research question is focusing on student growth, so student learning, following the same set of students across the school year last year to the current school year, trying to isolate how student learning, how students have grown since school shut down in March 2020. So first, I'm just going to give some kind of key takeaway findings, and then I'm going to walk through each of these a little bit in more detail. So in terms of our main takeaways, what we saw was that test scores for math were considerably lower, and that was in the range of 5 to 10 percentile points for students this year relative to students in fall of 2019. That was not true for reading. For reading, we saw that students' academic test scores were very similar to last year. So that was very good news in reading, that the students' performance is very similar to a typical year. We also saw that in almost all grades, the majority of students were making some learning gains since school shut down in March. And that was true in both math and reading. However, in math, learning gains were lower than what we would see in a typical year, resulting in a larger proportion of students falling behind relative to normal. And then finally, we did start to see some initial differences by racial ethnic groups in the fall 2020 data, particularly in reading for Hispanic and Black students, showing some small, modest declines in reading in the late elementary grades, whereas other groups of white students and Hispanic students were showing similar performance to the previous year. But we do want to put cautions on these findings because we also observed that many students were no longer in our sample this year. So students who had tested in fall of 2019 were no longer in the sample in fall of 2020. And that was disproportionately true among minority students, as well as lower achieving students and students in schools that were serving a higher proportion of students in poverty. And so as a result, we do worry both about the missing students and whether they're disengaging from school, but as well about the findings that we're presenting that we could be potentially underestimating both the overall impact as well as the inequalities in the impact. So those are kind of the main high-level findings. I'm going to walk through each of them in a little bit more detail now. So this first question, how are students performing this year relative to a typical school year? In this analysis, we have over 3 million students across the country who tested in MAP growth this year, as well as a group of students who tested with MAP growth on reading and math in fall of 2019. And this figure is illustrating the median percentile rank among the fall of 2019 students, which is the red bar that you're seeing, as well as the students in each grade level who tested in fall of 2020, which is the blue bar. So starting on the left from math, what we can see is that the students this year, the blue bar, are between 5 to 10 percentile points lower than the students who tested last year. And that's particularly true in the elementary grades. The largest drop-offs seem to be within the elementary grades, so grades 3, 4, and 5. In reading, what we see is that the two bars are very close to each other, so it's only 1 percentile point or so in either direction different. So very similar performance in reading between the 2 years. The second question is this question of growth. So looking at students as they transitioned from grade 3 to 4 or grade 4 to 5, how is their learning changed since March? So what we were doing was we were following students who tested in January, February, and early March, what we call the winter test, and then who tested again in fall of 2020, and comparing that growth to a typical prior school year. And this really helps us isolate the learning that has occurred since COVID, disrupted all of our schools, as the winter test point is our most recent test point, as most testing was canceled in spring of 2020, both for our interim MAP growth assessments as well as for the state summative assessments. So what we're seeing in this visual is the distribution of students' growth scores. So on the x-axis, we have the difference between students' fall test score and their winter test score, where a positive value means they've grown since schools were closed in March. A value of 0 means that students' test score this fall is exactly the same as where they were in the winter, and a negative value means that they've lost ground since the winter test. The red bar, or the red distribution that we're seeing, is the distribution in a prior school year, so that's a reference group. The blue distribution is the gains that we saw in the 2020, between winter 2020 and fall 2020. So starting with math, what we can see is that where this blue line falls, that's where the median 50th percentile student is. So if the blue line is to the right of the black 0 line, that means over 50% of students were showing growth. And so we can see that in most of the grade levels, over 50% of students were showing growth in math. Sorry, I have a cat attack. Okay, back to the graphs. Over 50% of students are showing growth in math. The red distribution is shifted over further, which means that in a typical year, more students are growing and are growing more than what we see here. So the student learning is lower on average than what we would experience in a typical year, even though there is good news that most students are growing. In reading, what we see is that the two distributions are completely overlapping. So basically, the growth that we observed this year is very much on par with the growth that we would observe in a typical school year. And the other way that we looked at growth is to measure how many students are moving relatively within our distribution based on the NWEA national norms. So what we did was we looked at students' percentiles in the winter before COVID, as well as in the fall after COVID, and we bend them into quintiles. And so these quintiles allow us to kind of look at the movement of students relatively based on what grouping they're in. So if they kind of stayed in the same grouping, if they moved up in the distribution, they would be up here in these green boxes. And if they moved down relatively the distribution, they would be in these red boxes. And so these students who are moving down, we're worried that we're concerned that they are losing ground at a higher rate. And we compared this to a typical year as well, and found that basically in math, approximately double the proportion of students have moved down in the rankings. So in a normal year, that would be approximately 15% that we call sliders, these students moving down in the distribution. This year, overall in math, it was about 31%. In reading, the results basically lined up between this year and last year, but in math, it was over double, which is what this table is showing. Whereas about 54% of students stayed in the same ranking. So that's good news, that the majority of students are kind of staying in the same relative area, but a higher proportion have moved down. And then one of the other key findings we really want to highlight here is that we examined the students who are no longer in our sample who tested in the 2019-20 school year, but were not observed in fall 2020. And we did see that there was a disproportionate number of students who fell out of our sample among ethnic racial minority students, students who were lower achieving in fall of 2019, and students in schools with higher concentrations of poverty. And so as a result, we have this, and I should say that worked out to be about 25% of the students in the schools that consistently tested between last year and this year are no longer showing up. So almost 1 in 4, which is a really high alarming number. And we can't say for certain why they're not showing up. They may have unenrolled from school, they may have disengaged, they may not have a device at home for the students testing remotely. But this is a lot of students and a very concerning finding, both in terms of being able to find these students and make sure they're engaged in school, as well as in terms of estimating learning loss or learning impacts. So in terms of our research recommendations and considerations from these findings, we have 3 primary research recommendations. The first is really, the importance of the continued funding at the state and federal level for school districts. We know that the safe return to school and some of the extra support that students will need this school year all cost money, and we think it's very important to make sure that we continue funding that at an appropriate level. The second recommendation is we really encourage transparent data reporting to most effectively target resources to students in need. And that includes both transparently reporting achievement data, but also measuring things like students' opportunity to learn and their social emotional well-being, and really breaking that data down by, to understand whether there are differences for students of color, English language learners, students with disabilities. And we think that this is really important to understand where there are the biggest needs among students this year. And then we also, one of the biggest takeaways from these findings is that math seems to be more impacted than reading. And so we believe this work really stresses the importance of equitable access to high quality math and teaching. And the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics encourages creative decision making about how students are organized for instruction, as well as the importance of maintaining high expectations for learning. And we think that these findings really point to the importance of the needs for really, high quality math instruction in particular. So I just have one more kind of summary of our key takeaway slides, and then I think I will pass it back to Chris to comment on these findings. So, just to kind of summarize the main takeaways, these findings suggest continued gains in reading, unfinished learning in math, and then they also raise important equity concerns about the missing data, particularly for students from underserved communities. So Chris, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. Yeah, appreciate it. And I'll be brief because I do want to get to the questions about the findings and those types of things. But I just want to highlight 3 things for you. I think first, the nature of the findings in reading are really interesting. I think teachers have done a better job of the 2 subjects of keeping text in front of students. It's also easier for parents to make sure that students are part of that conversation. And so whether it be, I have a 3rd grader at home, I do find myself being able to say, hey, can you read this and underline words that you don't know and dig into text, then sit down and actually do the mathematics instruction with them, which is a bit harder. So I think there is something to be said about how do we think about the unfinished learning in mathematics here as being a place where we as a country can do better. And it also plays out that mathematics is pretty sequential when you talk about how you teach it. You know, previously I was part of the writing of the Common Core standards, and you could definitely see in those standards how many things repeated in reading. So we were able to catch up some of the key characteristics in reading. In mathematics, it's very sequential about what you learn. So if a student, for example, missed some learning in the end of second grade, when they enter third grade, it might not be clear to that teacher what they missed from second grade unless that teacher had previously taught second grade or something like that. So I think the challenge around mathematics is an acute one, and it's something we're going to be dealing with even after we get back in school, I think. Once we get back in school, it'll be easier to remediate probably, but this is something we as a country could really focus on and make some gains in, I think. And then finally, I just would highlight what Megan ended with. I think there's just a need to focus on, you know, the 1 in 4 students that may or may not be in formal education right now. When we do get back to school, when we do get back in buildings, those students may or may not show up again. And how do we make sure that we're paying attention to that? How do we make sure we're not changing funding based upon that? So schools are largely funded by the number of students in their buildings. If we made a change in the way we were funding at this point, like with a quarter of the less money for most of these big districts, you would end up in a situation where schools wouldn't be able to respond when those students do return to school. So I think we just need to be cautious about how we're thinking about enrollment in this period of time, because it may not be 25% of the students are actually gone. We may just not be serving them today, and they may be back at the end of this time period. So I think those 3 findings, the reading, the math, and the students' findings, are all really, really good potential stories to write about, and we're happy to talk in more detail about that. So Matt, I'll kick it back to you for your reflections, and then we'll take some questions. Thanks.
Great, that sounds great. Great, I'm going to share my screen. All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen. So I just want to contextualize us with what was just presented and what we've seen going into this. And the first thing that is a good reminder is we had several projections leading up to this about how much learning we expected students to lose because of the pandemic. And so as you can see in my slide, I've summarized 3 commonly cited projections, including one from NWEA, including one from Credo, and including one from McKinsey. And the projections, I think it's fair to say, were really quite dire. In Credo, for instance, projected that students would have lost between 136 and 232 days of learning in math just from the spring. NWEA projected 50% learning loss in math and 30% in reading. And I've converted it based on what NWEA shared with me, converted that into percentile points. And then we can look at some actual data. So we have NWEA's data, average student loss 5 to 10 points in math and little or no loss in reading. And you can compare that to the projected learning loss of 10 to 20 points in math and 6 to 8 points in reading. We also have a couple other studies that are using also using tests that that schools have given students and use a similar approach to trying to measure learning loss. We had a study that was just released this morning from Renaissance Learning, and I think was reported over the weekend in the Wall Street Journal. And what's really striking about the Renaissance study is the finding is very, very similar to NWEA, which is somewhat reassuring, and it's something we don't always see in education research. But they estimate students lost 7 percentile points in math and 1 point in reading. Very, very similar, very, very similar to NWEA. And just so people understand what this percentile unit is, and Megan can interrupt me if I get this wrong, but it's basically saying a student who would have otherwise been at the 50th percentile, say, fell to the 45th or 40th percentile that's what they would have been in previous years. That's what they fell to if they had been tested in previous years because of the pandemic. And then we also saw an estimate from iReady about students who were far below grade level increased 10 percentage points in math and 6 points in reading. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so what can we take from all of these data points? So the first thing I would say is this is confirmation that learning loss did happen, by which I mean students learned less than they otherwise would have because of the pandemic. That is consistent with everything that we frankly expected with the projections. That's consistent with reporting on the struggles of remote instruction, and now that's consistent with the actual data that we're seeing. So that is a big deal. It also seems to be somewhat less bad than we would have expected, or less bad than the projections were. So we see that in NWEA's projected learning loss versus the actual learning loss. It's just not quite as bad. And that's good news. I think we can take a beat and appreciate learning loss happening, bad news, but somewhat less bad than expected. That is a silver lining. We're seeing consistent evidence that the loss is larger than math, and I think for some of the reasons that Chris just talked about, and that's not entirely surprising. We're seeing evidence that remote learning was not essentially an extended summer break, which I think was sort of our worst case scenario and our fears, and that was what led to the large projected learning loss, is that we essentially, we theorized that it could just be like summer slide, and not only were students not learning anything, but they were losing learning. We have evidence that that really is not the case, at least for the students who were able to study. We'll come back to that in a second. And then thirdly, the large inequities by race and family income have not shown up to the degree expected. And I think that has an important asterisk, and we'll get to that. But that we're not seeing these large increasing test score gaps or opportunity gaps that we might have expected. Let me be precise. We're not seeing substantial widening of the already large gaps consistently. Okay, so let me give a couple caveats, some pretty wonky points that I think are really important to understand though. So for one thing, it's actually sort of hard to compare the different estimates of learning loss to the projections of learning loss because they're all using different units. How does 230 days of learning compared to 5 percentile points compare to 10% decline in the number of students at grade level? There is not an easy answer to that, and you really have to get into the weeds of the different studies to make sense of that. So you cannot actually easily compare different projections and different actual estimated learning losses unless they're using the same unit. Fortunately, NWEA has created a good comparison to their projected learning loss and percentile points versus actual learning loss. And that I think is our best point of comparison to projected versus actual. Second point, and this is something Megan and Chris touched on. By definition, we're not able to capture the students who are disconnected from schools. We can't see how they're doing on tests that schools are administering because they're not in school. And that is a really important point, both because we care about those students and because we expect that those are the students who are struggling the most or who have lost the most learning. So if we're just looking at the students who, if we're not capturing them, we're just not going to fully capture the extent of learning loss, or at least we don't think we will. Another point is that testing conditions have changed for at least some students, and students may be taking the test. We know some students are taking the test at home where they otherwise would have taken it at school, and we might be worried about that they're getting help from siblings or parents, or looking up answers online, or just that something that complicates our ability to compare to last year. I know NWEA tried to address that and look at that. Some of the other tests, including I believe Renaissance and iReady, they did find some indication that that may have skewed the results. Lastly, on the caveats, I am not convinced that our test scores, and I don't mean this as a criticism of NWEA, I'm not convinced that our standardized tests do a great job of capturing reading skills, and this is a much broader discussion. But I'm just a little, the discussion touches on how do we actually measure reading skills, and there's some debate about that. And so I'm just a little wary of concluding, oh, well, there was absolutely no learning loss in reading. So broader considerations, to me, this is my own personal view, is that these new estimates may be an underestimation of true learning loss, while the projections were likely an overestimation because they assumed students learned nothing and in fact lost learning during remote instruction. And I suspect that if we had this perfect measure, we would get an estimate, the actual of learning loss, we would get an estimate that was somewhere in between, probably more much closer to what was just presented in the actual numbers. But I do suspect that it still may be an underestimate based on the caveats we just discussed. I also think it's really important to note that the inequities by race and family income and economic status may be worse this school year, compared to last school year. And that's because last school year, virtually every student in the country was learning exclusively online. And we know that's not true this year. We know that disproportionately students of color and low-income students are learning exclusively online, and disproportionately affluent white students are learning in person. And I think there's every reason to believe that that will exacerbate opportunity and testing gaps. We will have to see, but that is certainly my hypothesis, and it's really important to remember that the data that we have is just capturing the beginning of this school year, and it's not capturing what is happening during this school year. It's also important to keep in mind that these estimates of learning loss are capturing one aspect of schooling that we care about, but it's not capturing other aspects. There was recently a story in the Houston Chronicle about high school, the share of students who were failing 2 or more middle or high school classes. And I believe the number was, it had gone up in Houston ISD from about 10% to about 40%. And that was similar in other Houston area districts. That is an extremely alarming number. And it's indicative of a much larger magnitude in that high school course failure than in a standardized test score achievement. And I think it's, one thing that this latest data might point us to as well. Maybe the gaps in learning as measured by test scores are not the biggest gap, the most important gaps that we should be concerned about, and that there are other things, other aspects of schooling, whether that be course passage rate, whether that be social isolation, or other things that are worth highlighting in the conversation as potentially even more concerning. And then, of course, last point, we don't know anything about the long run effects of this crisis on students, obviously. We have every reason, including considering these gaps, to think that there's good reason to worry based on prior evidence and based on all of our reporting experience, including seeing how remote instruction has gone. And I think it wouldn't be appropriate to look at these findings, and I don't think Megan or Chris have presented it in this way at all, actually. It wouldn't be appropriate to look at these findings and say, oh, everything is fine. Oh, there was very low learning loss and we can make it up. I don't think that's the case. Yeah, so I will end it there. I have also, I had an appendix. I had a very long version of this that I realized was going to take an hour to go to get through it all, but sort of synthesizes all the different studies on this matter. I know I'm going quite quickly, but we'll make sure that's available for everyone so you know what is out there on this. And we can transition into questions.
Great. Matt, would you mind if I just react to a couple of things there? Because I think
I would love you to, please.
I think you're, obviously I would expect you to have a long appendix given your history with this topic. So that's great. Just a couple of reactions. First off, I do think pointing out that teachers in this moment have done a good job of not getting us to the worst case scenario is something that's really important. And so if you're interacting with schools at all, you know how hard this moment's been on teachers. I think for the most part, we have seen really good work from teachers about trying to do the best they can in the moment we're in, whether it's hybrid or remote only, or even face-to-face. So I think this data, these data do point to a trend that teachers have done a pretty good job with what they've been, the hand they've been dealt. And so I would just say that as one of the messages that I think is really important in this moment. I would also, I actually do think the reading test question is something that I would love to have a separate conversation about, because I think it's really important to dig in on reading assessment in general. But that's not, I don't really want to spend a ton of time on it on this call. But I do think that's a really interesting point. I would argue that I think our assessments do a better job of that than most, but I think there is still a lot of reason to believe that reading assessment could be better. So so that's something to think about. One other piece is, you talked about other data points, and I couldn't agree more. I think, we're releasing data in grades 3 through 8, where I do think some of the formative years around becoming a good reader and being able to do mathematics, it's really important in some of those grades, especially 3 through 5, 3 through 6, up into high school. But the high school data that you're seeing from other places is an important addendum to this research, because it may show that as you get into some of those course-based courses where you have to really deeply engage with the specific content, that there may be different types of disengagement going than reading and math. So I think I would just emphasize that point. So those were my reactions. Megan, if you have any, let's add them, and then let's do questions. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, particularly K-2, which we were not looking at in the study, is a really important time in a grade range that it's harder to do remote learning. So understanding the impacts on the younger students, as well as the high school, where we're seeing these alarming course failure rates across multiple districts. I think it's really important to keep all of those other pieces of evidence and findings in mind when considering the 3 to 8 results we're presenting here.
I think the early grade point is a really good one, and I think your data suggests that early grade students lost the most in math, and I think that makes the most sense. That makes a ton of sense based on remote instruction. What I saw from other data, and I believe it including in the Renaissance report that was just released in iReady as well, was that they didn't find consistent evidence that younger grade students lost the most, but they were also like, those grades we were most concerned about, the testing at home was skewing our results, which that doesn't shock me. Maybe for the younger grade kids, the parents are helping more, or an older sibling is helping more. So I think those are two things to keep in mind, that to the extent that maybe we're not seeing in other samples the bigger losses in early grades, that might be because of the at-home testing situation.
Yeah, I think it's something to explore. I think we were releasing grades 3 through 8 data because we have the most confidence in that data. I think that we would find we have more noise in our K2 sample for sure. So
Yep, great. So let's dig into this missing student finding. And I think what would be most helpful, Megan, is if you could start by characterizing what you see. We heard this number of 25%. Can you say what exactly is that 25%? How does it compare? Can you compare it to prior years? And who are those students? And then perhaps, Chris, you can elaborate. I know you already did a bit, but elaborate on what the policy implications and the interpretation implications of that are.
Yeah, so the 25% we're seeing is that we limited our sample to schools that tested in both years. So we wanted to isolate the attrition that was happening because students aren't testing within schools, rather than the fact that the school or district has decided not to administer map growth this year. So once we limited it to school districts that, in particular the schools that tested in both years, we then looked at the students, all of the students we had data for in the fall of 2019, who we would expect to still be in the grade range that map growth tests. So basically students in K to 7 who would then be moving on to grades 1st through 8th grade in this school year. And 1 in 4 of those students who we had K to 7 data in the previous school year were not showing up. And I don't offhand have a number for percentage for what that looks like in a normal school year. We did do a slightly different breakdown where we compared to the normal school year, but I can say for certain it's a lot higher. I don't have the exact percentage on hand of what that looks like, but 1 in 4 students not showing up. Given we've also seen school district reports of higher levels of absenteeism in many different school districts, I think that this is something to really be concerned about.
So that could be, so sorry. So obviously in prior years, that wouldn't be 0. We don't know the number, but you don't have the number offhand, which is perfectly fine, but it wouldn't be 0% in prior years. In normal years, you would see some attrition from the sample, but this is unusually high, and there could be a number of reasons why you might be seeing that. And perhaps, Chris, you can talk through again what those reasons might be and the concerns.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we don't know what the number was in previous years. We always see attrition in our samples, so it's not 0. I can tell you that much. But I think I can guarantee you it's not as high as this year too. So like those are 2 things that I do know. I would say that the policy implications are massive, right? So I already talked a little bit about the funding implications for that, and I think that's a story that is really important to cover in terms of if a big district loses a quarter of its students, they would theoretically lose a quarter of their revenue from whichever state they're in. Obviously, it doesn't line up that way just because of weighting and some other things, but it is something to look at. I would also just say when those students do come back, let's say they return to school in the fall or maybe even before this fall, what's going to be the arc of their education? We're used to being able to put the kids in the next grade. And are we going to be able to do that? Or is this a moment to think differently about what previous grade level skills look like? And how do we, especially in that 3, 4, 5, 6 range, how do we keep kids moving? And they want to, obviously parents care deeply about moving their kids along on the grade level that matches their age. But is this a moment to think differently about how do we catch kids up? How do we think about unfinished learning? I think those are 2 big policy areas where the recognition that we're just missing some students will be really important as we end the pandemic, hopefully.
Got it. I'll just do one more question, and then I want to turn it over to everyone else who I'm sure have a lot of questions. So I concluded my comments with saying, like, this is not a situation where we can say, oh, great, this learning loss didn't happen as we expected. Things are fine. But I am curious, someone that's not a wildly unreasonable interpretation of this data. Like, the projections were this, but this is far short of projections. Maybe the concerns about learning loss were overstated, and we can quickly catch students up who lost learning in math, and we didn't see learning loss in reading. I guess I'm wondering, I think this is for you, Chris, like your reaction to that. Do you take the glass half, a very optimistic view, more pessimistic, somewhere in between?
Just over half full for me, Matt. So
yeah.
I would just say, first off, and I already commented on this, but I'll just say it again. I think due to the hard work of teachers, we haven't seen the loss that we could have. And I really, really believe that. I think deeply in my bones, I've seen teachers do things that are just above and beyond. And this is in multiple districts that I've interacted with. And so I think the loss is less than expected, but there is still a situation where we see kids not doing as well in mathematics for sure. And I would argue that is largely due to how we advance kids in school. So we got to think about what they were doing in the previous grade. And if they miss that, it's going to be really hard for them to do well in the next grade. And so I think there's something deep going on about how we advance kids in mathematics here. I think, so I would, my headline is better than expected, but it's still a challenge for the country as we get back to in-person schooling fully.
So one other, I know that I said this was my last question. Welcome to my interviews, but one other thought is, like, we have been, myself included, have been referring to this phenomenon or predicted phenomenon as learning loss, but it's probably more precise to call it learning less, because we're not necessarily seeing students literally losing learning. We're seeing them progress, but at a slower rate than they otherwise would have. So they've lost compared to what was expected, but they haven't lost from where they started. Is that an accurate characterization?
Yeah, and Megan, you should double check me on the actual research piece of that to make sure that's accurate, but that's my understanding. And what I would also say is, you won't hear us say loss, because we're using the term unfinished learning because we feel like kids are advancing. You can see that in the data. They just aren't advancing as fast as they were when they were in person around mathematics specifically. So Megan, please do correct me.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that. But we do see some kids have actually lost ground in that their test scores this fall are lower than their test scores in the winter, but that's a minority of students. So I think unfinished learning is a good characterization of the overall story.
Got it. Okay, let's turn this over to questions. Allison.
Great. Thank you so much, first of all, for this great overview and in-depth discussion. I just want to remind the audience that you will be emailed a copy of the embargoed report after this webinar sometime today, and the embargo will lift at 12:01 a.m. Eastern on December 1st. And this webinar is recorded and should be available and will be emailed to you also, anyone who's registered, within the next couple of days. But with that out of the way, I'll get to the questions. We have a bunch as expected. I'm going to start with the first one, Joy Resmovitz. How do you account for at-home variables that could change the validity of the assessments? For example, parental help. How does that change the way you interpret the results?
Yeah, so prior to doing the research, we did a comparability study between the two modes. So students that we were confident were taking it at home and students that were taking it in person. And we found very little difference at the grades we released in this report. So we're confident in the data we're releasing today. As Matt did highlight in some of his comments, at the earlier grades, we saw more noise in that study. So we're not releasing that data mainly because we saw some back and forth. There may be more additional assistance in the earlier grades at home. So that's something we're looking at, and that's why we're doing grades 3 through 8. And nice to hear from you, Joy. Thanks.
And our next question comes from Charlotte West. Do we have any sense about the long-term impacts of this learning loss on college going rates and lifetime earnings?
Megan, do you want to take that one?
I will say that people have produced some projections. I mean, I believe Eric Hanishek produced some projections on potential lifetime earnings, but I think it's pretty early to say at this point that you know, we all make assumptions when we make predictions and projections, and I think those are helpful, but it's really too early to say what the real long-term impacts will be.
Sure. The next question is also from Charlotte, and it's just a general question about the report. Is the data broken down by region and state, or how is it broken down?
We are not currently breaking things down. We did do some analyses by whether schools were located in urban, suburban, rural areas. They're not in the final report, but we haven't broken anything down by state currently.
Good to know. And then from Daniel Dreilinger, what is the typical percentage of students who drop out of the sample?
We don't have that number in within the set of schools that we were studying here, but we will try to get that calculated.
Yeah, that seems like something we could come back with, Megan, and get back to. That seems like a relevant data point for us to get. Great,
good to know. I'll make sure to so that you can connect with Danielle. And the next question comes from Joanne Jacobs. Do we know what works in teaching math online? I don't know if maybe Matt, you have insights on this, or is there, I know we've kind of talked about the sequential aspect of why it's maybe a little bit further behind, but is there any evidence of what works?
Yeah, so Matt, you can add to this, but I would say, first off, I'm not the right person to answer this because I don't teach mathematics, but we have people on our team that would be really excited to talk about this topic. One of them is sending me a chat right now about how excited they are about talking about this. So, I think if we can set up an interview with one of our mathematics people, that would definitely talk about that and dig into what we see about the sequence. Now, from the top level, the hardest part about teaching math online is the process part, right? That we're trying to figure out how we get from grade 2 to grade 3, where you may be beginning fractions or beginning to learn, shifting to multiplication, which is really, if you know anything about math, multiplication is a add-on to addition. And that's what I'm in right now with my third grader, of trying to get him to shift his thinking. I think it's one of the places where elementary teachers need additional training, frankly, because we see in mathematics at the earlier grades that shift to the new type of thinking around mathematics has been some of the hardest that we've seen across the country. So I would look forward to setting up another conversation with Joanne or others about mathematics specifically with us. So, Matt.
I have nothing to add. I think that's the million-dollar question. And I think a question is, can we use assessment data to figure out what is and what isn't working? I don't know if we actually can, and I don't know if it's really a research-based question as much of a pedagogical question that teachers are far better equipped to answer than any of us.
Sure. Of course, reporters always asking the hard ones, right? Always the abstract. And then we've gotten a couple of versions of this next question, one from Patrick O'Donnell, one from Jackie Valley, which is for the assessment you gave out, do you know how many were taken in school buildings and how many were taken remotely?
We don't have specific data because we don't know which IP addresses are associated with which school buildings across the country. But we do know generally our sample is large enough to mirror what's going on in the country. So I would say with about the bellwether work around who's in and who's out, that's a good set of data to point to if you're looking for information about who's in school, who's out of school, those types of things.
And from Jennifer Palmer, are virtual charter schools included in the sample?
I don't know, Megan.
I believe so. They were certainly not purposely excluded. So, to the degree to which virtual charter schools are tested with map growth, they would be in the sample. But I can't say like what percentage or anything of all virtual charter schools would be in the sample.
Like all the schools are the schools in the sample are schools that opt to take the test yes. That voluntarily choose the map test. So I assume the answer is always, well, if the school chose to take the test, it's in the sample. If they didn't, they're not in the sample. So presumably some virtual charters do and some don't, right?
Yeah, and we have a lot of large virtual charter networks. So I think the sample will include virtual charters.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And then another question on sample size from Beth Hawkins. How many students were in the 2019 sample and how many students were in the 2020 sample?
So when we reported our sample size, we have a table, I believe, in the technical report that does break it down by year, but most of the time when we're reporting the sample size, we're looking at consistent students, so students who were in the 2019 and the 2020 school year. In general, it was, I believe, about 3 million students that were in the longitudinal sample. I'd have to go back and double check on the 2019 and 2020 separately. And I should say we are applying various inclusion criteria. So the number of students who actually tested with map growth this year is closer to about 7 million, I believe. But because of some of the requirements we put in about consistently testing across multiple school years, we got down to a lower number for this actual analysis, and also requiring them to be in public schools and other criteria like that.
Great. And then we have a question from Patrick Wall, and I think this is a good one to kind of think through, especially now we're towards the end. He's just kind of asking for a refresher, and I think it's helpful as kind of a cap to this conversation on how exactly this analysis is measuring learning loss. Is it looking at the same individual students and comparing their results from last year to this fall? And what is the comparison? Is it a student's expected growth versus actual growth?
Yeah, so I can take that. We did two separate comparisons. Our first was looking at the students who tested in third grade versus the students who tested in third grade last year. So that is two different groups of students, because students obviously are moving on to different grade levels. So that comparison is kind of the, a prior year of students versus the current year. But when we talk about growth or learning loss or anything like that, that is following students over time and looking at their own individual trajectory. So how much students have changed from their test score they took in winter to the test score the test that they took in the fall. So anything when we talk about growth or change, that's following a set of students across school years.
The main estimates, Megan, the like 5 to 10 percentile in math, is that based on the following students from year to year, or comparing it's based on the third grade versus third grade, so different groups of students, right?
Yeah, it's using the third graders in fall 2019 as a baseline for understanding the third graders in fall of 2020.
But one very important point is that these two different methods, although they're asking somewhat different questions, these two different methods are telling us something somewhat similar, which is that there's clear indication of learning loss in math, and there is less clear indication of any learning loss in reading. And there's some indication that students have made progress, and it wasn't as if there was complete summer slide during the spring. That's my understanding. Is that broadly right? And
yeah,
so
that's
that
correct.
should give us some confidence, because they're telling us the same thing, in the direction of the findings, although neither approach can deal with the fact that some students are just not in the sample because they didn't test, which of course cannot be dealt with because they're not in the sample, so we don't see what is happening to them.
Yeah, that's accurate. Megan, would you add to the second chart that you showed that had the colors, the red, blue, and green? That is same kid to same kid, though.
Yes.
So the first chart is third graders this year to third graders last year. The second chart is kid to kid, and both methods are showing the similar conclusion. So.
Yeah.
And oh, go ahead, Megan.
Oh, I was just to say that's exactly right.
And I was just going to remind the audience that we will be sending out copies of both PowerPoint presentations, so that way, people can go back and refer to all those numbers and takeaways. And then this is also a question kind of about the sample demographics. So this is from Megan Valley at the Bellevue News Democrat. Since schools opt in to do the test, do your sample demographics for a typical year without 25% missing match up to the national demographics for race, socioeconomic status, etc.?
Yes, they do pretty closely. We typically end up testing schools that serve, a slightly lower percent of Hispanic students overall is one of the places that the way our sample lines up to the national population is a little bit discrepant. But in terms of the kind of percent free reduced price lunch on average, as well as the kind of distribution across states and across urbanicity, it lines up very closely.
Great.
I think it's also important to note that this will be the biggest sample you'll see. So we just have the most students using MAP of any assessment around there. So like we'll be able to produce the biggest sample, and I think it's the most well-represented sample. So you should dig in if there's a line of questioning about the sample. That's all spelled out in the technical report. We will make sure to share it. We're quite proud of it, actually. So we will probably put it in front of you guys. So.
Great. And then this is another question, because a lot of our audience are also from local papers or regional papers. I know you mentioned that it's not broken down by state at this point. Is there any breakdown for anything? This question particularly comes from Bethany Erickson at the Percentile people. Is there going to be breakdowns by urban, suburban, or anything that people can kind of use to cater to their audience?
Yeah, so we were happy to have a conversation about what they might need. We have enough data to look at stuff differently, but I don't want to promise anything. We're not doing anything systematically around that, but if a specific reporter is interested, we could have a conversation about what might be needed. And we could, if it doesn't, skew the data or we get to too small of a sample size, we're happy to talk about it. So.
Great. Yeah, I think that probably a lot of people will take you up on that. And for our audience too, this is also an introduction. You are going to get follow-ups from NWEA and from EWA with the PowerPoint. So if you want to be connected, there should be a line to you right then and there. And especially as you go through the report and go through the slides again, feel free to reach out because as Chris just mentioned, you might get some extra perspective or something specific to your region or beat. And then before we close, I just want to ask a general question to all of you. Now that we've kind of had an overview of everything, gone into all the details, thinking that our audience, our education reporters, and learning loss is going to be a hot topic as long as the pandemic is going on and after the pandemic, what are stories that you think reporters should be covering that maybe are a little bit undercovered at the moment about learning loss? Or alternatively, are there headlines or angles that you think are kind of missing the mark? I know Matt kind of referenced earlier, not saying that these findings mean that there's no learning loss. I think that's a really important one to point out. But I don't know if there's anything else that you think reporters should really be keeping their eye on.
Well, I have a long history with EWA back to my previous role at CCSSO, so I know this question. You guys ask this question at the end of almost every webinar that I do with you. So, so I'll just say first off, Matt gave you some really good ideas. I would say the funding loss. I talked about that already, but that one is a underlying issue. If states don't deal with that, school districts are going to see big challenges in funding for next year, just because of the number of kids that are in schools this year. So that's one big one. I would also just say this is hard to cover because it's not clear that, in many ways it would be easier if we could come back and say kids aren't learning anything. That's just not what's happening here though. And kids are advancing, but they're advancing not as quickly in mathematics and in reading. We have some data that shows us maybe they're doing a little bit better. And so how you cover that is really complicated. And obviously people take your articles and spin them whatever way they want for their purposes. So I would just be really cautious as you enter this, that you make sure you understand deeply what the angle somebody's trying to take on this is, because I think it's more balanced than maybe a lot of people think it is. So I know I would defer to Matt for other thoughts on that.
I will just say I'll echo my previous comments of thinking more broadly about how we can quantify the effects of this pandemic on student outcomes and not limited to test score outcomes, which I think are and can be valuable. I think the recent Houston Chronicle story was a really good example of something, course failure rates, that we might be more concerned about. I'm a data test score person, but I think we need to understand that that is just one measure and an incomplete measure. I also think that this report is important because I think over the summer, some of the learning loss projections became ossified into learning loss facts. And now we actually have data to suggest that the projections were not through any of the fault of the projectors, especially you all, but the projections were not accurate. And again, they were projections, so of course they weren't accurate. They were best guesses, but we just need to be clear about that now that we actually have some data to confirm or disconfirm in some cases.
And Megan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just echo what Matt said. I think, test scores are really important, obviously a very strong indicator of what students are learning, but also beyond test scores, grades, course failure rates, measures of social emotional learning, these all tell us a story about how children are doing beyond just academics. And I think they're really important to keep in mind as we understand the impacts of the pandemic.
Great. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate those final thoughts. I know our audience, those are always top of mind as they're coming into these webinars. So I always like to end on that. I want to thank our panelists again, Matt, Megan, and Chris. Thank you so much for all the work you put into this and all of the takeaways. I know our audience, as we can tell from our attendees, is really interested in this topic and will continue to be. To our audience, you are going to get the copies of the report and the slides emailed to you, and also contacts. So for those more specific questions on, breaking down by district or state, I know NWEA has expressed that they want to do their best to help you and give you quotes and stuff. This has been on the record. Feel free to use it. But as a reminder, 12/1/20, December 1st at 12:01 a.m. is the embargo lifting. And then finally, please, 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 if you haven't already logged off yet while I'm rambling, don't forget to take the survey that pops up so we know what you want in the future as we're putting together these webinars. And with that being said, I hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon.